She's telling me what's going on. So I'll just share my screen there briefly, and we will crack on with our slides. I've utterly messed this up because I'm showing this to everyone else. So welcome to the first of our three-part webinar series. As I said, it's not a traditional webinar, it's more of a large meeting, but that's all good. We are calling this Inclusive Workplaces, Supporting Employers to Support Employees. And it's a collaboration between EmployAbility West Cork and Ability West Cork. They sound very similar, but we're quite different programs, but we complement each other down in this region. As you know, these webinars will be held today and on the 8th, which is next Tuesday, and then the following Tuesday on the 15th of March, between 12 and 12:45. So we will ensure that we get out on time. We don't want to keep anybody further than 12:45. So if there's any questions that anybody has, use the chat function. It's really useful. We'll be here kind of monitoring that, and we can answer anything that you might have any questions to. We'll also share the slides afterwards and with anybody that's registered for the webinars, so you'll be able to get loads of information from there. And the guest speakers as well have kindly said that they'll share their slides, and you can direct questions to them as well. So just a brief intro. Ability West Cork and EmployAbility West Cork are delighted to present this three-part webinar series surrounding inclusivity in the workplace. The aim of the webinars is to inform and support employers who employ people with disabilities. Obviously, this concerns everybody in our society, so we thought this was really relevant and very timely piece to kind of bring out at this time. Our guest speakers, and thanks, I'll just take this opportunity to thank all of our guest speakers so much. It really makes a massive difference bringing people, national organisations and guest speakers together like this on this platform. So Employers for Change are going to speak today. We have Claire, she's going to come up there in a minute. Sea Change, Mental Health First Aid Ireland and the Well Institute are all part of our kind of programme of events. So, you know, these webinars we are hoping will serve as a place to be informed, to learn techniques for managing your own mental well-being and to hear lived experience of disability in the workplace as well. So it's important to get that kind of personal voice, that authentic voice. And of course, we're here empowering employers to support their employees ultimately. Just briefly, the agenda for today, intro, then for about half an hour, Claire's going to speak for Employers for Change. Then Rahul is going to speak for 10 minutes towards the end, just kind of covering what employability is and what they do. And then there's a really brief kind of little questionnaire that will come up on your screen that you can just click, a little kind of scale. It's just for evaluation purposes. Briefly, Ability West Cork, that's us, that's myself, Laura and Danielle. We work down here in West Cork, obviously, and we've done so for the last 3.5 years, and we work with young people who have mental health needs, who are aged between 17 to 29 years of age, who have an address in West Cork, and who are experiencing difficulty in accessing education, training or employment due to their mental health needs. And we kind of work from like a personal, person-centered planning approach, really, and goal setting, and all of those kind of different things. EmployAbility West Cork works with people who have an illness, health condition or disability and who want to get a job or return to work. People that are involved with employability come from a varied backgrounds, from entry level to management kind of level, part-time to full-time staff, kind of that kind of work environment, I suppose, permanent or relief staff and early school leavers to PhD. So basically they cover a whole range of people within their service. And they also support businesses, which is really important for us here, I suppose, who want to recruit or retain staff or to become more inclusive to kind of help them along that journey. So today and next week, EmployAbility will discuss their work. Next week, they're going to really highlight the kind of financial supports and those kind of supports they can give to the employer. So I think that'd be really interesting for any employee or any employer that's here. So I'm going to stop sharing there now. And I'm going to pass it over to Claire. Where are you? You're up there on the screen. Claire Hayes.
Hello. Hi.
Where's the change?
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. Now, is that okay for everyone? Can you see that? Great. I just want to say a huge thank you and good afternoon to everyone for joining us today. I've got a little thing which I need to move here. I just want to say a big thank you to Ability West Cork and EmployAbility West Cork for hosting the couple of series that they are. It's great to see them engaging with this, and it's great to be invited to come and speak to you. My name is Claire Hayes, and in the spirit of inclusion and accessibility, I will give a visual descriptor of myself. So I am a white woman. I've got short blonde hair. I'm wearing a black and white polka dot shirt today, and I'm sitting in front of a blurred background here as I'm coming from my box room this afternoon. So for today's session, I will be talking with you about disability, the reality of the Irish context, the importance of the language we use, and how you as an employer can best support your employees who have a disability. I will be sharing my slides afterwards, as Fern has already mentioned. So if there's anything you'd like to reference, you will get access to these. So just to give a little bit of a context to who Employers for Change are and what we do. So Employers for Change is a free employer disability information service. We launched in March 2021 in conjunction with the Open Doors Initiative. The purpose of our service is to empower employers with all the information and advice needed to hire inclusively and to employ, manage, and retain staff with disabilities. So we do this in a number of different ways. We provide a dedicated helpline giving advice and information to employers. So you can call or text us depending on what you prefer if you have any questions at all. We have our website, which is www.employersforchange.ie. On this, we have numerous downloadable resources with information and toolkits that can be utilized from an employer's perspective. We also provide and participate in awareness training and outreach activities like this here today. We also maintain links with employer stakeholders and disability stakeholders. And we also promote positive business case for the employment of people with disabilities. Just for a little bit of context as well, the work that we do at Employers for Change is guided by a strategy group, and this consists of employers and disability stakeholder groups. So I want to give you an understanding of disability in an Irish context and why as an employer it is important to be disability inclusive. At the moment, there are nearly 650,000 people living in Ireland with a disability. This is more than the population of all of Connacht. 1 in 7 people in Ireland are living with a disability. This is 13.5% of the overall population. And yet people with disabilities are half as likely to be employed in Ireland compared to their non-disabled peers. According to the 2016 census, 70% of people with a disability aged 20 to 64 acquire their disability after the age of 16. So this is likely that many of us will acquire a disability at some point in our working lives. We can see that a significant proportion of the population are living with a disability, and as we age, this percentage will increase. I'd just like to note that these figures are the 2016 census, and obviously we're now into 2022 somehow. So we'd imagine that these figures will have increased substantially, and once we do the census again this year, we might see a difference and a bit of a jump in these numbers. So part of the business case for inclusion, I want you to consider and ask yourself, from a sheer business perspective, would you consciously, as an employer, lose out on a market with a value of 11 trillion euros? I'm sure for most people, the answer would be no. There are 1.3 billion people across the world living with a disability, and together with their family and friends, the spending power of the disabled community is almost 11 trillion euros. This is the share of the market you are passing up on when you are not hiring and representing people with disabilities within your company. As an employer, you need to be representative of all the people you serve in order to be successful. You can better serve customers and clients if you are representing them well. The Deloitte 2020 Diversity and Inclusion Report found that companies who had a truly inclusive culture were 8 times more likely to achieve better outcomes, 3 times more likely to be high performing, and twice as likely to meet or exceed financial targets. As well as that, a 2018 study by Accenture found that companies who were disability inclusion champions achieved, on average, 28% higher revenue over a 4-year period than those who were not. These studies that I've just mentioned are available on the Employers for Change website to download, or you can also Google them by name. I'll share them with Fern and the team afterwards, and they can be circulated along with the slides for anyone who wants to give them a read, because they're incredibly interesting facts and figures behind that it's the business case behind inclusion. So just to discuss disability and what we mean when we say disability. While there's no definition or definitive list of conditions that constitute a disability, there are some notable definitions. These have been used in legislation and official documents such as the Disability Act 2005, the Equality Act 1998, 2015, the 2016 census, which we've already referenced a little bit today, and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities. The 2005 Disability Act is the one most of you will probably be familiar with. The Act places a statutory obligation on public service providers to support access to services and facilities for people with disabilities. It is also under this Act that public service bodies are required to employ people with disabilities to make up at least 3% of the workforce. This will increase to 6% by 2024. And so this is oftentimes the definition used when collecting data by public or semi-state service bodies around disability. So it is a good one to be aware of. However, as part of our session today, instead of focusing on the definition of disability, we're going to look at some of the examples of disabilities people might have. I do find this tends to create better understanding and a more realistic way of raising awareness and having this discussion. So when we speak about disability, as an employer, it's important to understand what a disability means and the broad reality it actually covers. Disability can be broken into 3 different categories: visible, hidden, and acquired. A visible disability is something we can see or that we are aware of when we meet or speak to a person first. This can sometimes be a physical disability. A hidden disability refers to a disability that may not be visible at glance or that we might not be aware when we first meet or speak to a person. Invisible disabilities or hidden disability is an umbrella term that captures a whole range. Some of these can be attention deficit disorder, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain, cystic fibrosis, diabetes, epilepsy. It also includes dyslexia, which in fact 1 in 10 people have. And interestingly enough, people are oftentimes diagnosed later in life with dyslexia. And because of this, people will have built their own mechanisms and tools to overcome barriers without extra support, such as assistive technologies. Mental health is also covered in invisible or hidden disabilities. We note 60% of people who took part in a recent CSO, social impact of COVID-19 survey, said their mental health had been negatively impacted during the pandemic. So we can estimate pre-COVID that 1 in 4 people experienced mental health illness, and we imagine that this figure will be hugely impacted due to pandemic living and continued isolation. Visual and auditory disabilities are also included under invisible or hidden disability. This could be because an individual is using contact lenses or perhaps is using a hearing aid that you don't first notice. An acquired disability is a disability that has developed during the person's lifetime. This could be as a result of an accident or illness rather than a disability the person was born with. Acquired disabilities can be both visible and invisible. There is no definitive list of acquired disabilities, but examples can include accident-related injuries such as head trauma, spinal injuries, loss of vision, loss of hearing, injury or loss of limb. It can also include illness and health-related such as post-stroke disability, post-traumatic stress, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, motor neuron disease, and mental illness. So you can see from here that when we look at the different examples of disability, that there's a wide range and there's a huge broad spectrum to this subject. So I'm going to discuss the medical and social model now, just to give us a little bit, to maybe consider how we think and view disability. So last year, Ireland published its draft initial report under the Human Convention of the Rights of Persons with a Disability. While the convention does not include a definition of disability or persons with disabilities, it is underpinned by the social model of disability, which is what we will look at now. We can see the two diagrams here on the screen. On the left, we have the medical model of disability. This model rests on the assumption of what a disabled person cannot do. This could be because of a medical condition or impairment. For example, she cannot walk, therefore she will never be able to work. The medical model of disability will then focus on trying to help the individual to walk again through operations or equipment. This model locates the source of the problem as the individual disabled person, and in doing so places the responsibility for the situation onto the disabled person and away from society and how it is run and organized. On the right is a diagram. We see the social model of disability. This shows some of the thinking and assumptions of this model. The social model of disability holds that people with disabilities are disabled by the barriers operating in societies that exclude and discriminate against them. So when we look at a building with lots of steps and no lift or no ramp, it is not the wheelchair disabling the wheelchair user, but in fact the way that we have built the building. So now that we've considered the diverse disabilities people live with and discussed the social model of disability, we might just take a quick look at language. And it's oftentimes the first query that's often raised with us at Employers for Change. People many times are afraid to cause offence and are worried about what language they should and shouldn't use around disability. Language does matter, and everyone should always be respectful of others and their feelings. When it comes to disability, some people advocate for the use of people first language, which places emphasis on the person first and the disability second, i.e. a person with a disability. On the other hand, some disabled people prefer identity first language, and they say they are not a person with a disability, but rather they are a disabled person. This ties in with the social model of disability, where we see societal barriers and attitudes disabling the person. Irrespective of which language is used, the person is central and should not be objectified by using language such as the disabled. For instance, you should say a wheelchair user or a person using a wheelchair. You should not say wheelchair bound. Also, it would be good practice to avoid words such as sufferer or suffers from. It tends to have a negative connotation. It places limitations as well on the individual. And I think lastly, what we often say is to not fear the word disability, but it's not a dirty word to use in this situation. So I know I'm flying through all this information here, so I will set up, these slides will be shared with you. I just don't want to eat into anyone else's time after me. So what we're going to move on to next is reasonable accommodations. We've discussed disability and the importance of our language and how important it is to make sure that we're using the correct language. We'll look at reasonable accommodation and disclosure and how important both these are from an employer's perspective. The Employment Equality Act of 1998-2015 places an obligation on employers to provide an employee who has a disability with a reasonable accommodation. Within the Act, this is referred to an appropriate measure. The reasonable accommodation is something that helps to alleviate a substantial disadvantage due to an impairment or medical condition. The purpose of providing reasonable accommodation is to enable a person who has a disability to have access to employment or to participate and advance in employment. Employers must also make accommodations to enable people with disabilities to return to work having acquired a disability, as well as to participate in the job application process and enjoy benefits and privileges accorded to other employees. As I mentioned earlier, 70% of people with a disability aged 20 to 64 acquired a disability after the age of 16. So this is during their working life. So this point is actually quite applicable and probably a very likely situation for a lot of employers. If you as an employer have to make changes to the workplace or work practices to accommodate a disabled employee, The demand should be reasonable and should not impose a disproportionate burden on the employer. In other words, the changes on the cost should be realistic for the business to bear. These can depend on several different factors: the nature and the cost of the accommodation requested, the overall financial resources of the employer and the number of employees, the impact of the accommodation on the operations of the business. Under equality legislation, you as an employer are not obliged to provide special treatment or facilities if the cost of doing so is excessive or disproportionate. Employers should consider possible sources of funding, such as supports and grants provided by the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection when assessing the costs of a particular accommodation. On this point, however, I would like to raise accommodations are more often than not inexpensive or have no cost at all. Research carried out by AHEAD in 2019 found that over 2/3 of accommodations related to work tasks did not incur a cost whatsoever. Items that did incur a cost were readily available in the organisation. So just to give you an idea of what some reasonable accommodations could be, it could be considering an alternative way of carrying out a task. It could be providing information in appropriate formats or assisting in accommodation, maybe introducing captioning on your meetings like we're using today that Fern highlighted. These are all readily built into Zoom, Microsoft Teams, as well as PowerPoint. It could be considering adjustable height desks, or maybe hands-free telephone sets, or even providing a quieter office space when appropriate. And there's also access to assistive technologies such as Rewrite Gold or Grammarly that can help an employee who maybe might have difficulty reading long passages of text. So I've spoken about accommodations. However, to provide accommodation, there needs to have been disclosure in some form or in some way. Disclosure is making a disability known or sharing a hidden disability. While disclosure is the word generally used, people are tending to now move away from this word and instead are favoring phrasing such as sharing information instead of disclosure, as it kind of indicates that the person is perhaps confessing something and can sometimes have a negative connotation. Once the employer is aware of a disability, they can ensure that the required supports and accommodations are available and comply with that they as an employer can comply with their responsibilities under the equality and health and safety legislation. Sorry. So how should you as an employer approach this type of conversation? Approach the treatment of the information with an open mind and in a positive and constructive manner, acknowledging the challenges of sharing a disability in recruitment or job retention circumstances. It can be quite difficult for a candidate or a current employee to maybe come forward and share this information if they've already had maybe a negative experience previously. Do not let the fear of saying the wrong thing overtake your ability to support the person. When somebody comes to you, just actively listen to what the individual has to say. Take note of the exact nature of the impact of the disability. Also, I think an important thing to remember in these situations is that the person might share something with you, but they may not identify as having a disability. And therefore, they might not even realize that there are supports available to them. It's always important to follow the person's lead and the language that they're using in the situation. Give time to the person to explain their disability to you, as they may be nervous about confiding such personal information with an employer and may be wary of a negative reaction. Confidentiality of information shared should be protected at all times. Ask about whether they will require any supports in employment. Oftentimes they'll be able to tell you what supports they do require or where to access this information. They are the expert in this. Assume that it is possible to accommodate the person's disability, and so tell the person you will come back to them about supports and how they will be implemented. Do not assume that the accommodations cannot be met. And lastly, remember there is no obligation on any individual to disclose their disability. Therefore, they may not have spoken to anyone about the disability prior to their interaction with you. They may not explicitly tell you that they have a disability, but they might raise something they might find difficult. So you will need to listen carefully. Does the person mention that they find reading long passages of text difficult or tiring? Maybe they would benefit from assistive technology such as Read Write Gold, which will read out all text for them. It's important that a welcoming culture be created at the earliest stage so that employees feel confident in sharing information. So lastly, I know I've flown through these slides now today, but I'm just this last slide here, I think is a really important one just to have a look at. So taking all board all that we've discussed, let's just take a little look at these two images. We see on the left that there are 3 people trying to watch a football match, but there's a wooden fence in front of them. The man is tall and he's standing on a box. He can see the game comfortably above the fence. Next to him is a woman who is a little bit shorter than him. She is also standing on the same size box as the man, but isn't able to see over the fence. And next to her is a person who is a wheelchair user. The box is of no use to this person, and they are unable to access the view of the match at all. They have each been given the same means of access, even though their needs are very different. This image is called equality. On the right, you see the same 3 people. However, in this image, the tall man has not been given the box and is still comfortably watching the game. The woman has been given a second box and she is now able to see the game. And the third person, who is a wheelchair user, has been given a ramp and can now watch the game with his friends. This image is called equity. When we provide reasonable accommodations and create an inclusive work environment, we are creating equitable employment where people's needs are met on a case-by-case basis. I think this image is really important as we acknowledge that people need different things as we go into the workplace. And these are all important when it comes to creating inclusion. So that's me finished up. I will just cover the last key points that we've covered from today. So considering the spending power of the disabled community, including family and friends, is 11 trillion euros globally, it's fair to say that disability inclusion is good for business. When we are discussing disability, language matters, and we use a person with a disability or disabled person. Disclosure is not a legal requirement, but should be encouraged at all stages of the hiring and onboarding process and thereafter. Reasonable accommodations must be provided under legislation. However, accommodations often have no cost to the employer. Listen to the individual. They are the expert on their needs. And lastly, a culture of sharing accommodations and support results in a lower staff turnover. I'll stop sharing my screen now. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that, Claire. That was really insightful, and you didn't race through them at all. I know we have limited time as well, so no, thanks so much for keeping me in time. And I think actually, if anybody has any questions for Claire at all, you can direct them into the chat there, or if anybody has any one question at all that they think would be well answered now, do raise your hand, because we have about a minute or so before Michal sets the stage or gets on stage, let's say. I can see him working away. No, I thought that was really insightful. It's so useful to hear, like, even about the language, inclusive language to use, because I think language is ever evolving, isn't it? So it's always kind of difficult to know maybe what to say. People don't know whether they're allowed to ask or not ask, you know, those kind of different things. The reasonable accommodation as well, I think, is really important. And it's also good to kind of set the scene in the kind of legal, the legislation, kind of, you know, that kind of area as well, and what is and what isn't kind of legally required, I suppose. So no, thanks so much for that, Claire. And I know you're going to share the slides with me so we can send them out to everybody afterwards as well. So thanks a million. I suppose it's over to you, Michal. Michal is the coordinator of EmployAbility West Cork, and he has some slides to show everybody. Perfect.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for that, Fern. And thank you very much, Claire, for such an in-depth presentation. It was really, really informative. So I'm here to tell you about Employability Service West Cork. So we're an established organisation, I think, at this point. We're 21 years in operation this year. So what do we do? Employability Service West Cork is a service who helps people who have what we describe a person who has an injury, illness, or any other type of disability to find and to keep paid employment. It's a free funded service by the Department of Social Protection. It's an open labour market initiative, which means pay of minimum wage or over. It also means that all our clients have the same entitlements as any other employee working in the organisation. We are one of 23 similar organisations as well through the country. So I'm just going to put up a list of our job coaches here for you to see. All our job coach contact details are here. So if you're watching the recording, you can pause here and note the information. So how the service works. The service is an 18-month service. So when a client comes to us, they're referred to us from the Department of Social Protection. We work with the client, and there's an initial 3-month phase called the individual needs assessment, whereby we work with the client, look at their needs, look at their employment history, what they've done up to now. We look at the vocational profiling and career planning and come up with an employment plan. When this is completed, I suppose we then look on to the job search area. And again, this is done in conjunction with the job coach and the client. Once the person gets the job, we look at the job support and planning aspect of it. We always would be advising the client and potential employers of advice and supports. And then it leads to the follow-up support and mentoring to employees and employers. And I'm just going to read it or give you an example of a client's experience of, I suppose, working with the service and how it worked for him. So the client's name was James, and I have his permission to give his story here this morning at this presentation. So James was referred to Employability Service from the Department of Social Protection. James explained that he had a diagnosis of severe anxiety and depression, and that he did not feel confident in engaging with people. James explained to us that he had not worked for several years. So James met with his job coach, and within the needs assessment process, James explained that he wanted to return to work. It was identified that James had previously worked in the building profession. However, he now explained that he didn't want to return to that work. During the initial engagement process, James met with his job coach regularly, and during this time, James discussed his interests, his strengths, his previous work experience, and through the regular meetings and the developing of trust between James and his job coach, an employment pathway was identified. By the end of the 12 weeks needs assessment stage, James had identified that he would like to become a delivery driver, and his CV was prepared. Also during this time, other information was shared by James with his job coach. James discussed the impact of his depression and anxiety on his day-to-day living. His job coach passed on information to him with regards to counselling supports available, and James contacted his GP and started to meet with a counsellor. James also explained to his job coach that he had problems and issues with reading and writing. So through discussion and explaining to James of other services available to him, James accepted the support of a volunteer tutor from the Educational and Training Board and started to attend weekly reading and writing classes. As these supports were put in place for James, it was noticeable how his confidence was improving. James and his job coach were ready for the job search phase. Through the positive engagement, meetings and discussions between James and his job coach, an employer and a possible role were identified that James was interested in pursuing. The employer was contacted by the Employability Service job coach with James's permission, and a meeting was set up. James had a full driving license, but had never worked as a driver or a delivery person previously. A 7-week work placement, which Employability offers through our service, was identified as a possible route for James to get his foot in the door to the business, and the employer agreed to this. This scheme allowed James to undertake work experience for 7 weeks while keeping his social welfare payment. This time allowed James and the employer the opportunity to work, engage together, and to find out if James was a good fit for the business. James initially accompanied an existing driver of the company, but by the 5th week, James was getting on very well with his work experience, and he went on for the final 2 weeks to deliver the products on his own. At the end of the work experience period, a role was identified within the business, and James was seen as being a suitable fit and got a position of 30 hours per week. Now, James is a past client of the service, but is currently still in that role, working full-time and getting on really well. And this is only a very short synopsis and probably explained poorly, so my apologies on you know, how the service impacted on this one person's life. And I suppose just following on from that, just to tell you about employability, as I've said, we have a proven track record. We have a skilled, motivated, experienced team who work diligently and effectively to support our clients into employment. In 2021, 100 of our clients gained employment. We have 16 positions already secured this year. We had 139 new clients in 2021 and 26 new clients so far this year. Currently, we have 163 clients availing of our service, and 68 of those are currently in active employment. So how do we support employers? And I suppose just from the synopsis and discussing James's experience there, we build relationships with employers so that we can really understand the nature of their business and what they need from their staff. We have access to a diverse group of candidates, and we try to put forward the best possible fit for the employer. And when a candidate starts employment, we continue to support that candidate and the employer so that we can ensure the best possible chance of success. And then there are also a number of financial supports, as Claire has already outlined, that the department make available to us, and my colleagues will discuss these in a much deeper way in the next session. So look, thank you very much. I hope that gave you a little insight into what Employability Service West Cork does. Yeah, so if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you. Thanks, Fern.
Thanks, Michal. I think it's great, and I mean, I know this is we're kind of West Cork based here, and I think most people, well, there's people from all over the country, I think, here at the moment, which is fantastic. So I suppose there are employability services around the country, as Michal mentioned. There's also, you know, Employers for Change is a national organisation, so you know they're kind of contactable, I suppose. I've dropped actually the kind of links to websites there in the chat if anybody's interested. I've also dropped in Employers for Change, their employer toolkit, which might be useful for some of you. But it's well worth having a look at all the different websites there that we've put up. There's such a, you know, a vast range of resources there as well, you know. Is there anything at all that anybody would like to kind of flag, or any kind of questions that you might have brought to this session? Anything that we can clear up while we're sitting here? Nobody? That's fine. Must have answered all those questions. I suppose what we're going to be doing, I suppose you can kind of see the kind of run of it from today. This will be the kind of scenario for the next 2 sessions as well. Next week we're going to have fantastic Valerie, who's actually sitting here today watching, from the Well Institute, to talk us through some kind of practical kind of tools and tips and techniques for kind of mental well-being and those kind of different kind of areas. And employability, again, will discuss the kind of more in-depth kind of financial supports that are available to employers to support their staff. And I think they're really useful, because we kind of, I suppose, unless we get told what's out there, it can be tricky to find out what is available and what's not available. So it's always useful to use these kind of webinars to kind of inform yourselves of a kind of up-to-date information, I suppose. Our third session on the 15th, we will have Sea Change, who have challenge mental health stigma or stigma around mental health, both in the kind of workplace and just in society in general. And we're going to have the manager of Mental Health First Aid Ireland, Donald Scanlon. He'll be speaking about supportive behaviours and also mental health first aid itself. So that's kind of the run over the next 3 weeks. It'd be great to see everybody for all of those events, if possible. I am, before we go, because I am conscious of keeping everybody time-wise, we don't want to kind of overrun. We have a quick evaluation kind of questionnaire. It's not arduous. It's literally, it'll pop up on the screen, and it's 3 questions, and literally just click you'll see. Anyway, I'll show you. It's easier to show you than try to describe it. You can see it there now. It's anonymous, so we can't see who's voted on whichever answer you have. So you can see it's just for our own evaluation purposes to see whether what kind of improvements we can make to webinars like this in future, and what other, whether the information came across clearly. So if I don't know if you can all see that, can you, everybody? So you can work away and click on the answers there if you don't mind. If you fancy. There's 3 questions, like I say, around enhancing knowledges about supports, about reasonable accommodations, and about how to respond to an employee disclosing that they have a disability. Again, Claire mentioned that disclosure is moving away from that language of disclosure and more kind of using more inclusive language there as well. Sharing information. Cannot click, Darren. Is that everybody?
Yeah, I can't click either, Fern.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah, we can see the options, but we can't actually.
It worked so well in the
trial.
Sorry, in the trial, we trialed this two times. Is that the right way to say it? I'll try it one more time, and if it doesn't work, we'll do it the next time. Yes, continue. So try that again there. If nobody can do it, don't worry. I'll send it out by email.
It's good.
Yeah?
It's working there now, yeah.
Woohoo! Brilliant. You see, this is why it's so good to have like everyone in the room to speak to. If it was just a one screen, we wouldn't have found that out. Brilliant. Seems to be working. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. I have to thank everybody for your kind of presence today. It means a lot to kind of support these kind of initiatives, I suppose. I think one thing that this is kind of demonstrated for us as Ability West Cork is our work with EmployAbility West Cork. There's kind of collaborations, and we're always looking outwards to collaborate with other organisations, and I know Employability are as well, linking in with different organisations around the community, to kind of strengthen, our position to be able to kind of go out and deliver our programme in the most kind of holistic way, I suppose. So that looks great. We seem to have quite a few there. Is everyone happy with their questions? I'll give it another minute, and then I'll click out of that. And again, I will share I'm actually going to stop the recording now.